Good morning, Ms. Rink.
Hi, good morning.
Loved the lesson yesterday, so we're going to take some time to talk about it. And first question is, overall, how do you think the lesson went and why?
Well, I think it went pretty well. It seemed that the students were engaged. They definitely were engaged in the previewing activity and processing that with their partners and through their activity that they had with the sorting and the categorizing.
That was one of the highlights. That was
And based on the review of the scale that we did, at the end of the lesson, it seemed that almost everybody had some growth. It seemed almost all the students, maybe except for like 3 students, actually jumped up on their scale.
Nice.
So I would say that it went well.
Good, good. All right. So what I'd like to do is I would like to take you through each element that I rated and talk about those elements. Before I do that, I want to have a larger question, again, connecting this year's evaluation to more of that growth mindset. Because remember, when we met during the pre, I told you that things are a little different than last year. I mean, I remember last year when I went in, I think I rated you on, 22 or 23 elements, and I really wasn't even sure what design question you were in, and we kind of talked about it in the post-conference, but this one, I hope you felt like it was a lot more focused on you telling me what you were going to do, and then me being able to provide you meaningful feedback, because we kind of categorized those dominant elements and your deliberate practice element that we were going to be looking for. And when we talk about these elements, I'm really going to be speaking in terms of 2 things. The desired effect. So as we know from looking at this document of the domain 1, 3 lesson segments, we know that each one of these elements has a desired effect.
Right.
And the desired effect is always written in terms of the student's will or the student's can, so that it's all about not as much teaching, but it's about learning. So when I talk about why I rated you where I did, I'm always going to speak in terms of, did the strategy you used in the category of element that you used, did it reach the desired effect? And did you, this is the second part of this equation, did you monitor to make sure the desired effects was reached? And the more monitoring we do, the more we ensure that learning actually takes place. Okay? And before we start that, I want to re-talk about these levels and how these levels kind of go into the rating.
Okay.
So I brought a copy, I have it on my computer, of the protocol that you're aware of. It's on Office of Professional Development's Marzano site, has all of these protocols there for you to review, and I know you can download this from my observation as well. So when I go in and I rate on my computer, I am looking at this protocol for each of those elements that we predetermined I'd look at, and then the other elements I see. So when we look at this document, we see there's some teacher evidence of the element, there's some student evidence of the element, and then really what I want to look at is this scale. So when I finish by scripting all the information within that element, I have to make an evaluation on where I believe you are. Not using would be strategy was called for but not exhibited. Now, I would never rate you as not using unless we had a conversation about, that element was needed here, why didn't you use it? Because you may tell me something like, I purposely didn't do that because I did it yesterday, or I was planning on doing that, but I'm going to do it tomorrow. Whereas or if you said, I wasn't going to use that element, then we could potentially be talking about it not using. Then we have beginning, where you're making an attempt to use an element, but there's missing parts. There could be more there that would need to get it to that developing range. Developing is when you actually use the element or a strategy within that category of elements where there's no missing parts. You did it just as the protocol calls for you to do it. That is actually really good. And I think last year we talked about developing, and I guess if you really clearly think of the word developing, you're like, well, I don't want to be developing.
Right.
I want to be higher than that. But when you're at a developing level, you are actually using the strategy or element as it was intended, and there are no missing parts. But when we move to applying, what we see the big difference in all of the elements is we see that not only are you implementing that strategy with no missing parts, but you're monitoring that the desired effect of that element is occurring for students. So, and you did that on a couple of them, and I'm gonna show you how you did that. And then if we look at innovating, you get to the level where you're actually adapting and creating new ways to monitor because something happened in the class that called for you to do something different. So innovating is there's no specific way for this to happen. It's you are recognizing that your monitoring efforts at applying, you need to do more for a group of students, or in some cases an individual student. So that truly is what separates applying from innovating.
Okay.
But I want to be clear that developing is a very good level for any teacher to be at, because you are truly using that element with no missing parts. Just moving it up is talking about monitoring for desired effect. So let's jump right into it with your deliberate practice. And your deliberate practice was understanding learning goal. So let's look at it in two ways. So the DQ1, communicating learning goals, you chose number 1, providing clear learning goals and scales. And then if we look at the desired effect, student understand the learning goal and the levels of performance in relation to the scale. So when did you bring that artifact for me?
Yes.
Your notebook.
Yes.
Okay.
Here's the student
So let's look at it real
notebook.
quick. Okay. So I was actually looking over the shoulder of a student, so I got a pretty good look at this. So when I'm looking at this, what I see the learning goal at the top. Okay. I see a place for students to write down any of the other information that they want to write about that, and then I see your scale.
Yes.
And I see a place for students to mark where they are and to actually write in dates that they achieved that level. Now that gives you, I didn't see this yesterday, but that gives you an opportunity to also celebrate success with them, because you can then go in and say, okay, look at the jump you made, whether individual or as a class. So when I look at this, in addition to this, and at the end of class, you asked the students to rate themselves, and I saw all the students were doing that, and I saw you walking around to ensure that they do that. But in addition to that, because if you just did that, it's okay, it's certainly developing. But what you did is you then formatively assessed them at the end of the class with that ticket out the door. And that ticket out the door was truly seeing that they achieved the learning goal that you had for that day.
Yes.
So with that information, I need to ask you a question. And then I'm going to give you my final decision on this level.
Okay.
When you assess that ticket out the door, did you note any students that did not achieve the level that they may have rated themselves?
There were a couple, based on the responses that they had to the questions, there were a couple that I noticed really weren't hitting on that actual connection with their learning and the learning goal.
Okay. What's your follow-up plan?
Well, I wanted to have a conversation with those students, to meet with them, and to see, really try to narrow down and hone in on what particular strategy or what particular concept that they didn't get, and then try to do some type of reteaching, maybe working on some of the vocabulary a little bit more, and then really looking at some more analysis with particular characteristics.
Perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to rate you at in understanding learning goal and the levels of performance is I'm actually going to rate you as applying on that. And the reason I'm going to rate you at applying is because not only do you have a clear learning goal posted in the room, you have a clear learning goal written here, and you have a scale that corresponds with that learning goal. In addition to that, and this is where we're going to talk about number 2, knowing the levels and can describe them, I'm actually going to rate you as applying for that as well, because these two really do go hand in hand. And the things that you did with the learning goal as related to the scale directly impacted the number 2 element, which, let's make sure we understand that one, tracking student progress.
Yes.
So they track their own progress,
Yes.
they understand their own progress, and you followed up. Now, looking at innovating in this, your response when I said, were there any students who didn't meet that goal, and how are you going to attain that? What I want to hear from you is a specific way that you've pre-planned for those students who, because when you have a classroom of 22, all right, let's say, basic response to intervention training tells us that I know that probably 4 to 5 students in the class of 20 are not going to reach my desired effect. So having a pre-planned intervention technique to be given the next day is going to get you that innovating, and you're almost there because you started to verbalize, I'm going to probably do some vocabulary work, I'm going to probably have a conversation with them. What I need to hear is, I'm specifically planned for the event that some of my students would not reach that learning goal, and therefore tomorrow I'm going to do this, this,
have it ready.
and this.
Got
See
it.
what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because when we do that, we intervene instead of remediate. Remediation is a way, but we know once we're in the cycle of remediation, it's almost too late.
Yeah.
So I want to hear a specific intervention, because that's showing, as our protocol says, that you're adapting and creating new strategies for unique student needs, and you're right there. You've set up the condition to reach that desired effect, and now I just need to have a more clear response for when those students to get it.
I think that's definitely easy to do. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So we've got applying for element number 1, we have applying for element 2. And since that was a deliberate practice goal, and last year you had rated yourself, I believe as beginning. I think we had you as beginning because you were using the generic scales. So it was there, but it had missing parts. So in literally 1 year, you've moved to applying. That's quite an accomplishment. So your work with Mr. Astley definitely helped out quite a bit. Okay, the next element I want to talk about is element number 4. And if we look at element number 4, it's under DQ6, establishing rules and procedures. And when I look at my protocol, it says teacher involves students in designing classroom routines. Teacher uses classroom meetings to review and process rules and procedures. Teacher reminds students of rules and procedures. Students ask students to restate or explain rules and procedures. Teacher provide cues and signals. And then we look at student evidence. This is the one that I really want to focus on with you, is students follow clear routines during class, and there's an orderly pace to the class. And for this one, even though this wasn't a dominant element, we still talked about this in our pre-conference, and I did have plenty of information to actually score this one. And the reason I scored it really was about, there were 2 instances in this lesson where you transitioned from you leading the discussion to students processing and students turning and talking. And that really came in, which would be element number 7, organized students interact with new knowledge. It was overwhelmingly obvious to me that students talking, whether processing, whether they were deepening, whether they were reflecting or elaborating, is not new to these students. When you gave them the prompt or the question or the activity with the strips, they engaged in that activity with no downtime. I mean, it was just, they were on it. You then transitioned from the teacher leading the discussion at the front of the room to the facilitator of the group work. So when I think about getting to that applying and innovating level, and I think about how a teacher monitors the desired effect of this particular element, it is by being an active participant in their conversations. I heard you engaging in conversation with students. I heard you redirecting students. I heard you actually telling one of the groups to remember what our rules are for courteous turn and talk. When one of the students kind of challenged the other student with what they said, you said, remember, we respect values and we respect opinions in here. And I actually heard you, kind of redirecting a group that was clearly moving in the wrong direction, and you just adapted that that task to what we were doing. So for DQ6 element 4, I actually gave you an innovating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because if we look at this domain 1 as truly involving routine events and enacted on the spot, those 2 set up the conditions for the lesson segments addressing content.
Right.
And had you not had such a highly established classroom routines in that classroom, I don't think DQ2 and the elements that you used in DQ2 would have been as effective. I mean, just looking at your processing of new information, had you not clearly established what it meant to be in a group situation and how to talk and not use some skills as a facilitator to redirect those conversations, none of those would have been as effective, and the desired effect would have been met. So
that's pretty important.
yeah, you can't do DQ2 without DQ6.
Right.
You have to be able to have those things. So I'm not giving you an innovating there. You earned an innovating there.
Well, that's really good to hear, because I do take time in my planning to really think about, how I want to group my kids, when they process information, how I want to organize them together. Because at some tasks I feel that they can learn better, just like with twos, but I think some tasks, like they have more people to really bounce off ideas and really work through things, that it will serve better if like 3 or 4 students work together. So it's something that I have been intentionally planning as I'm going through, but I really didn't realize that,
Yeah.
that's what it was meant to be. So I appreciate you taking the time to really describe that.
Perfect. Good. The next one I want to talk about is element 28, which is maintaining a lively pace. And again, it wasn't one that we talked about as being a dominant element. It wasn't one that we really spent a whole lot of time on. But when we talk about DQ5, we talk about engaging students. And I did ask you a question about engaging students.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall right, you did mention to me something about transitions.
Yes.
And the reason I'm going from DQ6 number 4 to DQ5 number 28 is because in this case I believe they went hand in hand. And I gave you another innovating on this, and that was because you had in that class, if I can recall, 1, 2, 3, a minimum, well actually four transitions. You went from the previewing activity, which led to identifying what the critical information was. You did a turn and talk.
Mm-hmm.
You transitioned to 10, where you put them in groups of 4 to look at that, reflect on information, and then you did the wrap up where you had them rate themselves on the scale and did
Yes.
that ticket out the door. So that was 4 transitions in a 15-minute class, and I didn't see learning, or I didn't see downtime affect the flow of that class. So the engagement technique, whether you planned it or not, of having those crisp transitions, which is in the protocol, was at a level, at a very high level, at an innovating level. And there were also, the reason I'm going with innovating on this is because there was a time when you were in element 10 of processing, in that activity with the strips, where you purposely did some status checks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you did that because you sensed that the lesson should be moving faster than it was. And that happens in group work, right? There's always an element of off-taskness that you need to be engaging
Right.
with. You stopped them, you went around the room, you said, I want you to give me an update on where you are. And what that does is it tells the groups that are behind that they need to catch up because another group is almost done. And then you gave them time, you gave them like 1 more minute to finish that activity, and then you checked in on them 1 more time even before that ended. So I saw you recognizing where you were in that transition, where you were in that activity, and purposely intervening to move it up to get it to where it was crisp again. Because had you just let that go, you would have increased off task.
Yes.
So that 4 and 28, you do that very well, and I gave you an innovating on that as well.
That's great.
Okay.
I think it's so interesting that you caught that, because when I am planning for the activities, particularly group activities, and I pair up or I group up particular students, I already know, I have a good idea of which groups are going to kind of get a little bit more off task than others. So I try to employ different strategies like proximity control, also with them to make sure that they do stay engaged in the task. And like with the status check, I do that as another thing that I plan intentionally, because the students actually, they kind of wait for me to do that, and they need me to do that to keep them going on the task and to keep them engaged, and it also gives them accountability, with the work that they're doing, in the groups too. So I appreciate you looking at that.
It was a great one. Okay, so let's move now to our elements that we categorize as dominant elements. And remember, we talked about 6, we talked about 7, we talked about 8, and we talked about 10. And we also talked about 9, but 9 came more in the planning of those chunking contents. And I actually believe that in 9, the content chunk that you chose was perfectly adequate for the lesson that you gave today. It didn't seem to be too much, and it certainly didn't seem to be too little. So when we go through these, there is an underlying theme that I want to keep bringing back. And remember, we talked about the way that we really start to score these elements is we score them based on desired effect, and we score them based on monitoring of that desired effect. And when we looked at these 4 developments, I found the same common theme coming through with the majority of them. And if we look at identifying critical information, we'll start there. But identifying critical information for this particular lesson came through your previewing of new content with them, building that background knowledge, and then organizing them to interact in their turn and talk partner, because that was the way that you used to begin to identify critical information. So when we look at those 3 without really breaking them apart, I actually rated you developing on each one of them. Okay. And here's why. I thought that each one of those in and itself was implemented without any missing parts. Previewing, you gave them an article the night before. You gave them clear instructions on what you wanted them to do with that so that they'd be ready for the next day. The next day, you began talking to them about, now you're going to get in your turn and talk partner, and you're going to begin to identify with each other what you felt important. And then at the end of that activity, you summarize for them what you felt was important. And then they kind of compared, well, what did I feel was important, and what did the teacher feel was important? What was missing here is a time at the end of that activity, or even during the activity, where you actually went through and made sure that the students now understood what was important. You could have done that through questioning. You could have done that through a quick assignment, like a formative assessment assignment. Like, okay, now that we've established this, let me hear back from you what is critical. So the activity in itself was really good. I mean, I think the majority of those students probably walked out of there understanding, but I'm not sure I'm 100% sure.
Right.
Because I didn't see the monitoring of the desired effect of each one of those strategies you were using with this. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So thinking about that, what do you think you could have done? If we look at growth, maybe the
Right.
next time I come in and if we're looking at these same elements, what could you have done?
Well, I could have probably done a quick formative assessment. Maybe have some shared out responses with the whole class.
Yeah.
To get a good gauge on, if they're really getting it or understanding it.
Yeah, I think that would have been perfect, and it probably wouldn't have taken that much longer.
No.
Because then in moving into processing of new information, like as you move through this cycle, those first 3 elements that you highlighted were led by you. Even the group work was led by you. Like there was you told them what to do, and you knew what you needed to get from them. But once you get to 10 processing, you let them go, right? That you let them go in that activity. So what we want to make sure is before we turn the learning over to them, that we truly have reached the desired effect of those previous elements, because that identifying critical, if they don't have a good understanding of what's critical, and you don't yourself know that they know what's critical, it's going to be really hard that they're processing the right information.
So this really sets it up
Yeah.
to get into them, to the gradual release for them to take
Absolutely.
over. Okay.
And you're so good at checking in with the groups to make sure that they're engaged and to make sure they're behaving appropriately and following routines, that to add that monitoring piece, it's there.
Right.
It's there because you're so good at interacting with groups. You just got to ask the right questions to the groups to make sure that desired effect is being reached. Yeah.
Okay.
You okay with the developing?
I am.
All right.
Well, now that you explain it the way that you
Yeah.
did, I have a better understanding of it, and I could see how I can easily, implement something.
Perfect.
So thank.
Okay, and the last element from DQ2 that we talked about seeing was going to be element number 10, which is processing of new information. And the desired effect of that one is students can explain what they have just learned, ask clarifying questions, and or actively discuss the content. So you had the strips where they had to now start categorizing those 3 different topics into the 3 different regions or colony regions that they had.
The characteristics, right.
Again, I'm going to go back to the same thing that I did for the other ones. I gave you as developing because you absolutely, it was an appropriate strategy for that element, and it was, they definitely were engaged in that activity, but the missing component was at the end of that activity, when you closed out that activity, how did you monitor that they were reaching the desired effect of what this states? So again, when you were walking around in the groups, I did see you talking to them. I saw you pulling them back in. I saw you reminding them to be respectful of each other's answers. But there were some opportunities there for you to monitor that they were actually categorizing correctly and putting those things in those places that they wanted to. So again, when we look at developing, the strategy is being implemented correctly. All we need to work on in future plans is how do I monitor that this strategy is reaching the desired effect that I want it to. Okay. So as we kind of close with our discussions of that, how did your reflection after the lesson, or some of the things we talked about it, how will it inform changes to your instructional planning or plan going forward? Like, is there something you would have done different?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and for that processing activity, I mean, the kids were, interacting, and they were moving their strips of paper around and categorizing. And I think also going back on what you just said about the monitoring piece of that, I think I was more focused on just making sure that they're attending to the task rather than actually looking at, what they were doing. So I think now that that's more conscious to me, I can, start doing that. But then seeing how they just had it on strips, I think I neglected actually having them record that, I actually now created a graphic organizer that I think that we can go ahead and go back on, and they can write in the characteristics that they categorized on this graphic organizer, and then put this in their academic notebook as another artifact for them when they go back to study for the final assessment.
So when you would have done this at the conclusion of that,
yes,
and that would have been monitored,
right?
Because you could have monitored that the notes that they were writing on this graphic organizer could have been what you needed them to get from that information.
Right.
So that would have been another element, right? Yeah.
Looks like, yep, element 12.
Yeah. So you could have got another element out of that same activity, and I think there was some time to do that within that lesson too before you went into the scale thing. So overall though, I think where you were in DQ2 to be at that developing level, being that this year we've really just started to really unpack these elements and get to where the desired effect was, and the fact that I didn't see any at beginning means you're implementing them with no missing parts. We just need to look at that monitoring and you've already said this is how I would have monitored this through appropriate note taking.
So it sounds like I'm doing okay.
You're doing great. You're doing
to
great.
enhance a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I just want to go ahead and summarize
Absolutely.
the overall scoring of what we just talked about.
Yeah.
So looking back at the elements that I was scored in, element 1 and 2, I was scored at applying.
That's those clear learning goals, that scale and tracking progress. And remember, that was your liberal practice.
Yes.
So that was quite a jump.
And I did
for you.
improve from where I was last year.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then 4 and 28, I was at innovating. And then 6, 7, 8, and 10, I was at developing. And that was really because of that monitoring piece, that I really wasn't really working and looking at the monitoring of the students and if they were really meeting the desired effect of the strategies that we were using in class.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, and then after I reflected on the lesson and the artifact that I brought with the graphic organizer, that we realized is actually part of element 12 as well, I could have been scored on element 12 if I implemented, and it also directly relates to the monitoring piece and how that graphic organizer and me checking that and using that could be another type of monitoring strategy.
Absolutely. Great summary. And the other thing that I want to make a quick PLC connection, because what we're seeing as a school when I talk to the assistant principals is this reoccurring theme of monitoring, because I don't know that last year we really talked about that. We didn't really talk about monitoring, and we didn't really talk about desired effect. But as you're having those PLC discussions, you can kind of bring that up. Like if we're going to plan to use a strategy such as how are we going to identify critical information in this chunk of content, we can also add that question: how are we going to monitor?
Have it always as a piece of the conversation.
Always a piece of a question, and then you intentionally plan the monitoring, just like you
Along with it.
because I think as teachers, and I think I could reflect on my own teaching career, I was really good at planning activities, and I thought they were engaging activities, and I thought that kids really liked it. But when I reflect on my teaching, I'm not sure I ever planned for how am I going to monitor for that activity. So it's not really in our comfort zone, right? But I think if we put it in our comfort zone, what we're going to see is we're going to see more student learning, and that's what it's all about. So definitely some growth areas, which again, that's why we're doing this. But some we've already seen some growth, so we're heading in the right direction.
Great, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.